My name's Tom Wakeford, and I'm delighted to be joined by Pat Thomas and Ruth Hancock, who I'll introduce properly in a moment. What we're going to do is start with each of us speaking briefly on a theme within this huge area of new technologies. And then we're going to go into breakout groups so that we can drill down a bit more into particular aspects of new technologies. And then we will hear back from those groups and have some discussion. And then we will have a final opportunity for each of myself, Pat and Ruth to make some final comments right at the end. So great to see old friends and new faces, not all of them faces yet in the session. I will start off by just saying we're running this as a Zoom meeting, so there isn't a Q&A separate tab. So if you want to start putting questions in the chat, that's fine. But as I say, we are going to go into breakout groups, and then we will have feedback from those breakout groups and a period where people can make comments, ask questions, and at that point, I think putting them in the chat would be really useful, particularly as there's quite a large number of us here. I'm going to start off by introducing myself, and then after I've spoken for 10 minutes or so, I will pass to Pat Thomas from Beyond GM, and then to Ruth Hancock from Land Workers Alliance. And just before I start, I'm really grateful for those of you who have signed up for the first session, which unfortunately didn't go ahead, which Pat and I were also involved in, and then transferred to this one. We'll hope to cover some of the ground that was going to cover in the same slot. So I'm Tom Wakeford. I am with ETC Group, which is the Action Group on Erosion Technology and Concentration. We do research to monitor the potential and actual impacts of emerging technologies and corporate strategies on biodiversity, agriculture, and human rights. We also support communities to evaluate new technologies. So we're supporting popular and social movements who share our values. We've worked for many, many years with La Via Campesina internationally, with the European Coordinating Committee of Via Campesina in Europe, and in the UK with groups like Land Workers Alliance. And been a feature of Oxford Real Farming Conference for, I think, since the beginning, since my colleague Jim was based in Oxford, who some of you may know. And I'll be mentioning later on an international platform for assessing new technologies called assess.technology, which was also mentioned in the description of this session. Having said all that, I'm not speaking on behalf of ETC, I'm just speaking in a personal capacity. I'm also aware as I talk about technology that I'm a, stretching over his laptop, white middle-class man. I'm living in one of the richest countries in the world, and I'm talking on issues that most acutely affect working class people, most of whom are in countries of the global south, and living in communities in the UK as well, of course, and other parts of the so-called developed world. And I'm also aware that most of the discussions about technology are dominated by men. So I'm really glad to be outnumbered, and I will keep my contribution to time. I said that I will now make sure I'm timing it. So the 10 richest people on Earth have a combined income of $858 billion, according to the latest Forbes report. They have that is more than the gross domestic product of the 85 poorest countries in the world, and sort of bring it back to a more European context, it's more than nations like Belgium, Switzerland, Austria, and Norway. So that is important context when you're talking about technology. And we are in a capitalist system, and it's a system of racial capitalism. All capitalism is inherently racial capitalism. That's a system that allows racial superiority to be there in all its layers. All the layers of capitalism have racial superiority there. A system of socio-economic stratification. And the inventor of the term racial capitalism, Cedric J. Robinson, states that capital can only accumulate by producing and moving through relations of severe inequality among human groups. Therefore, for capitalism to survive, it must exploit and prey upon the unique differentiation of human value. So there's a widespread argument now that even you hear it, even investment banks saying it, that capitalism, the capitalist system isn't helping build the system of equitable, anti-racist, earth nurturing, small-scale agroecological farming we might want to see. And I think you'll hear more about that from Ruth in a few minutes. But what worries many of us in the agroecology movement is that we are now suffering the delusion that salvation from capitalism can be found in new, more clever capitalism based on new technologies, but which are governed by the same rules of capitalism that got us here in the first place. Now, the way that societies think about the future, and in this context about technology, is underlain by imaginative visions or myths. Mary Midgley, who some of you know, who recently died in her 99th year, but was arguably one of the greatest philosophers of the last 100 years, talked about these imaginative visions. And during the 19th century, the use of mechanical metaphors to describe the living world hardened into a program for technological advancement that we now call scientism. This is the extreme view that physical science is the only reliable source of knowledge, and that the applications of technologies based on these understandings are the only reliable route to human progress. According to the ideology of scientism, converting hand-weaving looms into vast factories, transforming self-sufficient farmers into drivers of tractors is a prerequisite for human development. As the Industrial Revolution took place, European colonial states and companies that served them gained control over the majority of the world's natural and human resources at a disastrous cost for most people and for the environment. Far from bringing development, these changes forced skilled artisans, peasant farmers, and other laborers to carry out machine-tending tasks, pushing many communities, particularly in the global south, into social and ecological crisis. The minority elite who drove this vision forward were able to ignore the harm caused to the majority of workers, particularly women and children, and the natural world in the form of pollution and biodiversity destruction, because they had the wealth to cut themselves off from its impacts. These descendants of these same elites are now proposing a tsunami of new technologies to solve many of the problems that scientism created. These include digitalization, the collection of and processing of data on human behavior, agricultural and fishing practices, genomes and ecosystems. Also synthetic biology, which is the design of living organisms and processes from gene systems, and geoengineering, the intentional large-scale technological manipulation of the Earth systems. Recently, the term ecomodernism has been coined in support of adopting these new high-tech approaches. At ETC, we prefer to use the term eco-scientism, making that link to the ideology of scientism. So eco-scientism is the application of scientism to environmental issues. Adherents of eco-scientism believe that the application of disruptive industrial technologies will enable humanity to bypass what had been thought to be ecological constraints, thereby solving crises like climate change and biodiversity loss. Now a coalition of corporations and some technologists imagine an eco-modern future for the whole world. And it should come as no surprise that these schemes are underpinned by the same exploitative relationships between industrial machines, racialized human beings, and non-human nature that underpinned Europe's original system of racial capitalism, otherwise known as imperialism. So just to give you a little overview of what technologies we're talking about here, I'm just going to do a screen share of a new graphic we've produced describing these, actually for a project that's based in Asia Pacific. But if you go to assess.technology and look at the most recent posts, you can also access this map, but I'm not going to spend long on it. It's just to point out that what we've done is, beginning with the tech titans, the billionaires and mega corporations investing in a new wave of disruptive technologies. We've gone through the different technologies. You can scroll around and click on, here we have meat alternatives or fake meat, such as the Impossible Burger. We're going to be producing a series of infographics analyzing these. But this is just an overview. I think we identified about 18 different technologies, got facial recognition here, digital machinery here, artificial intelligence, sensors, 3D and 4D printing, synthetic biology, Internet of Things. I won't go through them all. And over here, a reminder that 70% of people in the world still obtain their food primarily from local smallholder food webs. I'm going to start off by talking about just one of these, the blockchain. The blockchain is a decentralized digital ledger that is replicated across numerous locations. It's the backbone technology behind cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin and Ethereum. Now, I'm taking this technology, I should say, as one of three highlighted by Land Workers Alliance in their response to the Soil Association's report from July of last year called Agroecotech. And they highlighted these three technologies as ones they had major concerns about how the report had analyzed them. So blockchains, by concentrating power in the hands of secretive mega corporations, allowing no right of appeal against the algorithms it uses, undermines local systems of governance, including safeguards to protect the environment. It also uses huge amounts of energy. In 2019, Bitcoin used the same amount of energy as the whole of the Netherlands. Many believe currencies like Bitcoin are actually acting like pyramid schemes. This business model recruits members via the promise of payments or services for enrolling others into the scheme. As recruiting multiplies, recruiting becomes impossible and most members are unable to profit. As such, pyramid schemes are unsustainable and usually illegal. But blockchain's been around 13 years. It's still not benefited anyone apart from a few already rich people. It hasn't saved a single species or improved the well-being of any grassroots communities. And I look forward to during the Q&A session if people have got examples of where they've done that. They are selling a promise that has not delivered to the, I think, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who've now invested in them. If you want a good analysis of this phenomenon, there's a rather fun podcast called Tech Won't Save Us. And the episode from early December uses the comparison of mobile phones. So cryptocurrencies have been around about 13 years now. And for 13 years, they've been saying, invest in them, they'll make you rich. And they use the example of an iPhone. So the iPhone was invented 13 years ago. Imagine if when you handed over what was a very large amount of money for an iPhone, or soon after similar smartphones, you were told, oh, you wouldn't get the iPhone now, you'd get it at some undefined point in the future. It's now 13 years later, you've still got no smartphone. Now, moving on to the other example, I wonder if we can apply this sort of pyramid selling logic, or certainly deferred benefit of a technology, the killer app that blockchain is meant to deliver, to genetically modified organisms. It's exactly 25 years since the first GMO was launched in the UK. Some of us are old enough to remember the little cans of Flavor Saver tomato concentrate appearing on the shelves of Sainsbury's. And where are the benefits? And I think Ruth will be touching on this later on. Certainly, if you read the Soil Association's report, you will get a very particular view. This again is the Agroecotech report. You'll find this sentence: worldwide, GMOs have been grown for over 15 years, and across 1.25 billion hectares, the accumulated empirical evidence suggests that this has been relatively safe, and that the benefits of these crops outweigh the costs and have disproportionately favored poorer farmers. But if you read the report, or if you've read it already, you'll agree with me that it provides very little support for this view. It won't take you long to look at the websites of Land Workers Alliance, probably Beyond GM, and certainly ETC Group, to see that genetically modified organisms have, for smallholder farmers, been a disaster worldwide. The emperor has no clothes. So earlier I defined power. Sorry, I didn't. I should have done. At ETC, one of the definitions of many ways you can define technology is power and resources sustained over time. So it is the power of corporations like Bayer, formerly Monsanto, of Jeff Bezos, and we'll come back to digitalization later, I hope, of all these powerful forces, governments, to take control of data, to take control of how farmers obtain their chemicals and therefore their seeds, and push particular sorts of seeds. That is about sustaining power and resources over time. But it's also the power to shape the media, and that in turn can shape how people think about things. And every 90% of the printed media in the UK, 90% of the readership is newspapers controlled by just 3 billionaires. And one of them is a lord, and the other one is Rupert Murdoch. So George Orwell talked about power as being tearing human minds to pieces and then putting them together again in shapes of your own choosing. And I think the danger is that is happening with some of these new technologies. So now, even with social media, we are seeing groups critical of new technologies. Certainly some people we work with closely at ETC Group have found their social media accounts blocked because they've been critical of GM, not being anti-vaxxers, not saying, there's a evil lizard plot to take over the world, but just being critical of GM. So, it's not as if social media is our savior here and we know who controls that. So I will stop there. And what we're going to do now is I'll stop sharing my screen, and we're going to go straight on to our two next speakers. And then I'll describe how we'll go into the breakout rooms. So over to you, Pat Thomas.
And I'll unmute myself so you can hear me. Thank you, Tom. That was really interesting. I'm going to share my screen because I have given in to the PowerPoint hegemony here. So just give me a moment. Right. So Beyond GM, for those of you that don't know, it exists to bring the public back into the GMO debate, to raise the level of that debate, and through our Bigger Conversation initiative, hold space for trickier conversations which involve all sides of the GMO debate, including those who are for, those who are against, those who are ambivalent, and those from all different disciplines, not just scientific or laboratory science disciplines. So what I wanted to pick up today is some of the things that Tom was saying about genetic engineering, because it's a very live issue here in the UK at the moment. Some of you will, hopefully all of you, will be aware that the 2021 consultation into the deregulation of genetic technologies in the UK has ended up with the government saying that it is going to deregulate GMOs in the UK. This was an entirely tick box exercise, this consultation. The short consultation period, the high level of technical expertise required to even participate, and especially the prejudicial statements made by government ministers and DEFRA officials before the consultation, during the launch of the consultation, and throughout the consultation period made it very clear that DEFRA had made up its mind before consulting the public. And much of the public engagement with the consultation came via campaigns in the end, and DEFRA removed these responses, about half of all responses, from its final analysis. Even so, the figures quite plainly showed that 85% of those people who responded to the consultation believed that gene editing should be regulated. I think even more telling was the widespread criticism of DEFRA's justification for deregulation, was that it was deregulating gene editing because gene editing produces organisms that could have occurred naturally or through traditional breeding. And you might naturally expect that a lot of the eco groups and groups like ourselves would have taken exception to that framing, but what you probably missed, and what DEFRA didn't really report on, was the comments from more friendly, GMO-friendly groups like the Institute for Food Science and Technology, which called the framing overly simplistic. The Microbiology Society said it was purely philosophical. The Roslin Institute found it exceptionally challenging. The British Veterinary Association refers to it as fundamentally flawed and misleading, poorly defined, and likely driven by industry. The Royal Society called it problematic and noted how rare the phenomenon actually was. The Royal Society for Biology said it provided no clear criteria. And the FSA's own Advisory Committee on Novel Foods and Processes noted that it would not be possible to say categorically that any modification made via genome editing will present a similar risk to a product produced from traditional breeding. So the government has chosen to ignore not just the public, but the science in service of an ideology around tech and innovation, which is crude, but as Tom alluded to, it's also devoid of any meaningful context. So with that in mind, what I thought I would do, and I am going to really rattle through this quickly, and I apologize for that. I'm going to give a quick overview of where we are in the development of GMO technologies in food and farming, because I think a lot of people in their heads are still where they were almost 25 years ago, when two types of crops dominated the scene: herbicide resistors, which are engineered to withstand multiple sprayings of pesticides, like herbicides like glyphosate and dicamba, and insecticide producers, that is, plants that are engineered to produce their own insecticides. And these genetic changes have been applied for a very long time only to a handful of commodity crops like soya, maize, oilseed rape, and cotton. But it's not just crops anymore. Today, gene editing technologies extend beyond plant species into a variety of different livestock in both agriculture and aquaculture. We're now looking at a world where insects, both those that carry diseases like mosquitoes, but also beneficial pollinators like bees, are the focus of gene editing ambitions. In the case of the bees, one of the proposed ways of altering their genomes is to engineer them so that they're able to withstand the insecticides that are used on agricultural crops. So, you know, this is not a holistic view of farming. We most genetically engineered microbes and algae, what am I doing here, are not necessarily used in the lab anymore, but they are engineered to produce food ingredients and flavorings and aromas, usually high value things that would otherwise be grown by small farmers in developing countries, things like vanilla and cocoa and saffron, but also orange flavors and stevia and vetiver and coconut. But this same process used on microorganisms can also be used in field applications, for instance, microbial seed coatings and soil enrichment products. And the idea is that we coat seeds, or we inoculate the soil with plant growth promoting and nitrogen fixing GMO bacteria and fungi in order to make farming more profitable and more efficient. And the direction of travel here is to exempt these uses from labeling because, hey, they're natural, and therefore also exempt them from monitoring. And a lot of this work on microorganisms sits on this synthetic biology or synbio spectrum. And part of that spectrum also involves creating artificial DNA written on computers and printed off on 3D printers to be inserted into natural organisms. And current applications for synbio include oils and probiotics for food processing, including for supplements, for baby foods and formulas, but also the much publicized plant blood that is in the meat analog, the Impossible Burger, is also a synbio ingredient. And synbio is used in other meat, milk, and cheese analogs created using altered yeasts. And I think it's really important to be aware when we're talking about sustainable food that processed vegan foods are a very big part of the target market for this technology. What have we got here? DNA tracers. This is a new technology in development, and the idea is that we use short strands of synthetic DNA or re-engineered DNA to act as biological labels. The idea is that as an agricultural product goes through the distribution chain, it can be traced by tagging it with DNA that carries information about its provenance. RNAi sprays are sprayed directly onto plants in the field. They temporarily switch certain genes off without actually changing a plant's DNA. The process is called gene silencing. It's being focused on pests and disease management, but the future uses include to boost yields and to speed up the ripening of certain crops. Gene drives. Oh, there we go. Never mind. Gene drives are also used in the living field, using the living field as a laboratory. The gene drive can be engineered into an organism so that it spreads genetic modifications quickly through other parts of the field, onto other plants, and into the natural environment. And finally, all this is leading to a point where all of these genetic technologies can spread beyond the farm into free-growing plants and free-living animals in the wild. And this is a serious proposal which suggests that gene drives and synthetic biology could revive declining species or extinct species, or eradicate invasive species, or improve soil or plant health or biodiversity. There are some advocates of rewilding who think that this is a really, really good idea. So Tom alluded to the Soil Association's Agro-Ecotech report, which was published very quietly last July. I'm going to bring it up again because, having listened to all of that, there's probably a lot of you who would think, you know, that's great, but this has nothing to do with me. I support agroecology. I'm an agroecological farmer. But here's a couple reasons why you're wrong. The Agro-Ecotech report was written by a consultancy for the Soil Association. That consultancy had a very close ties with DEFRA, and it reviews in very glowing terms a whole range of agri-tech, suggesting that it can help agroecological farmers. And there's a lot to be disturbed about in this report, but for me, I think the worst part is that it is so divorced from organic principles and also agroecological principles. The second thing is the FAO strategic framework, again, which was published early last year, I think, which focuses almost entirely on digital, robotic, and genetic solutions to sustainability, and contains the rather chilling statement that systemic approaches like conservation agriculture, integrated agriculture, agroforestry, and the various agroecologies are essentially entry doors through which these emerging technologies could become more widespread within the farming system. Now, proposals like this look at technology from a values neutral point of view, and they ignore the key fact that all of these technologies are part of a completely integrated business as usual model. Many of the companies promoting artificial intelligence and drones and robotics also have divisions that sell seeds and chemical inputs, and the information that they harvest, I love that phrase, is specifically for the benefit of the company and its shareholders. So my hope for today is that we delve a little deeper into all of these things, that we come away from this session recognizing that we need a different kind of engagement with this issue, one that's rooted in clarity, and in particular, clarity about the criteria that we need to assess different technologies. I'll give you a little flash really quickly on this last screen. And this comes from my days when I was editing The Ecologist magazine. You know, there are researchers all over the world grappling with how we assess technology, and we used to be bombarded daily with tech companies telling us that they had the technology that would save the world. And so I circulated an early version of this. It's not original to me. It's something that I found. It was based on questions put forward by the French philosopher Jacques Ellul. And I've tinkered with it over the years, but these are the kind of questions that we need to be asking about in technology, not whether it will work or what it might do, but questions that are grounded in human sensibilities and values, and places those at the center of the kinds of questions that we need to be asking about technological innovation. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Pat. I will pass straight on to our final speaker, Ruth Hancock.
Hello everybody, and thank you very much, Pat and Tom. That's gosh, there's a lot to chew on there, isn't there? I'm Ruth Hancock. I'm the coordinating group member of the Land Workers Alliance and an agroecological farmer, mostly vegetables, but also some chickens in East Devon in the UK. For those of you who are not aware, I'm sure most of you are, but the Land Workers Alliance is a grassroots union of agroecological farmers, foresters, fibre producers and fisherfolk. I think we may have a couple of fisherfolk on our in our membership now. So yeah, so much technology. I mean, we're using technology all the time, aren't we? But it's these emerging technologies which make some of us quite nervous, and I think with very good reason. I mean, I'm sat here in my mobile home, which is a piece of technology, and here on the stool is my harvesting knife. So, you know, and these are old technologies which have been modified over time. But I think most of us can sort of feel there comes a point at which we've gone beyond our natural remit, and well beyond. Hence, we're facing climate crisis and many issues around pollution, which, you know, again, I probably don't need to rehearse to you, but it was quite interesting for me. I was at the COP this November just gone, and we had very many interesting discussions around these new and emerging technologies and GM and what have you. But the fact that agribusiness, industrial agriculture, even DEFRA, it's a double-edged sword. They're starting to recognize and use the word agroecology because, you know, it sounds good, and they hear the agriculture, and they hear the ecology, and they think those two things together, that's a thing that we can sell, that people can agree on. And on the back of that, we can also introduce, as Pat was saying, all these bits of technology through the door, which is quite a chilling, as Pat said, quite a chilling idea that agroecology is being used as a platform or as a gateway to introduce things that we don't feel are beneficial. And so often what's left out of the agroecology, certainly when it's spoken about by industrialized agriculture or companies who are wanting to exploit and extract from the agricultural system, is the social aspect. And I think, you know, Land Workers Alliance, we really do represent the social justice element, the land justice, who gets to work the land, who gets to really benefit from the nutrition of the land in all those aspects. And tomorrow we're going to be talking about the FAO's suggestion that peasant farming doesn't feed quite as many people as was thought. But then looking at that report, it turns out that their definition of what's a small farmer is under 2 hectares. And even then, those farmers under 2 hectares are producing an awful lot of nutrition from their land. And the way that that nutrition is being produced is really through us as farmers using methodologies, technologies, skills that have been built on over hundreds, thousands of years. And it's not that we're resistant to new technology or to innovation. We're innovating and using new technology the whole time, but we're also doing that within a framework of understanding, truly understanding our position in ecology as human beings, as human animals who are taking nutrition from the land and also nutrient recycling back to the land. So, you know, the way that these new technologies are being framed in terms of we can push beyond, you know, isn't, you know, beyond our natural limits. It's like, why are we not understanding that we have this abundance already in the natural world? We have a lot of food, but the food that we're producing is high in calorific value, the hyper processed carbohydrates such as through corn syrup or modified forms of wheat and grains. It's like this is not really nutrition taken by itself. And so the metrics in which it's being measured that we can produce this extra food, which it's arguable we don't actually need this extra food in terms of extra calories. We need extra nutrition as humans, and that tends to come from biodiverse systems where we're growing a multitude of crops, and to grow a multitude of crops on any area of land requires human input. And as agroecologists, as the Land Workers Alliance, we're representing small-scale agroecological farmers, and there are so many people wanting to come into this form of meaningful employment and wanting access to land. And if we are allowing these new technologies, which basically consolidates the power of industrial agriculture, because some of us feel nervous about using technology, or we don't have the finance to access the technology, the education to access the technology. All these things become extra barriers to us as humans interacting with our food, producing our food. It's against food sovereignty. So yeah, it's a case, you know, it's the same old, isn't it? It's very glossily presented, and it is disappointing to read the critique, or rather lack of critique, from the Soil Association in terms of seeing these new technologies as neutral. Because, okay, any technology, you could say, put it in a box in a vacuum, is neutral, but if all these things have an anthropological framework, they don't arrive in a neutral way, because they're produced by corporations who want to make a profit from them. And of course, you know, that's the way that capitalism works. And if we're going to redesign our food system, redesign our energy system, then following that same old capitalistic model, as Tom's pointing out, is just, you know, it's another blind alley. It's been proven, it's been shown that the Green Revolution and all the fertilizers and other oil-based inputs, that's agreed generally is a dead end. So now it just appears that we're trying, or agribusiness is trying to send us up another blind alley that may well be profitable for them for another 10 years or so, but it's not anything to do with nutrition or food system justice or any of those things. So yeah, I mean, really, it's about the open source and the freely shared knowledge and networking and methodologies that really can't be bought or sold. And I guess this is why there is this resistance in so many ways to agroecology, because if we do it well, we do transactions between each other. We don't need so much of this external input, and there isn't a chance. We have short supply chains as well. There isn't a chance to extract, and so it's quite, it's interesting that this word agroecology has been co-opted in a way. It's like many of these things where when you're campaigning for something and you're ignored, that's very frustrating. But as soon as you're no longer ignored, that's because your opponents are starting to get a little bit worried about your presence in the whole sort of sphere of the area. Once you start to be listened to, then you're onto something, but you also know you're up against something. So yeah, from the Land Workers Alliance point of view, we're really concerned about the undermining of farmers, the small scale farmer, and the access to land, potentially marginalized lands that have been used by marginalized farmers for so many years. Can they now be exploited by these new technologies? And yeah, it's of great concern to us. Thank you. And pass you on.
Thanks very much, Ruth. That's great. So thank you all the people who are staying on to this session, because I do realize we're up against at least 2 really interesting and overlapping sessions, but it's going to get much more interactive now. So I hope you're interested in that. We have 4 breakout rooms, and I will introduce each of them. In fact, I will allow the person leading them to introduce them if they can do that. I'm going to host one with my colleague Soledad Vogliano on digitalization and data colonialism. Actually, I'm going to put these in the chat and then you can see them. Ruth is going to host one sharing experiences of digital tools as farmers, as consumers. Pat is going to host one about gene editing criteria for evaluation. And finally, Saurabh, who's just popped up, thanks Saurabh, is going to cover in what ways can modern technologies be decolonized. So maybe I'll go last, but Pat, would you like to say what's your gene editing one? We'll cover very briefly and then people know.
Anybody who would like to join, I'd love to have you there. We would like to start this year a process of defining criteria for the assessment of genetic technologies specifically, but other technologies as well, that are used in agroecology. And we think that this is something that needs good farmer participation, as well as, groups that are involved, civil society groups that are involved in this. So anybody who would like to jaw around how we begin to define that criteria, I'd love you to join me. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. I'll go to Saurabh next.
Hi, my name is Saurabh. Thanks, Tom. I work actually at University of Sussex, and I want to discuss with you all, for those of you who are interested in this issue of how modern technologies, more generally, the new technologies, the emerging technologies that Tom has been discussing, but also many of the Green Revolution technologies that Ruth and others mentioned, how do they embed sort of colonial ambitions of colonial supremacies, I must say, of control and extraction of resources, benefiting some while dispossessing others. And if they facilitate in those processes, how can we now think about ways to decolonize technologies? Is there hope for that, or are technologies always doomed to be embedded inside colonial circuits?
Thanks very much, Saurabh. As I said, my presentation along with Soledad will be about a sort of introduction to big data, digitalization and data colonialism, which we call the latest capitalist assault on food systems. And then finally, Ruth, do you want to briefly describe what your focus is?
Yeah, I would like to talk or hear about people who are using various technologies on their farms, but also people, what would they like to see being developed, rather than us always sort of, lagging behind or appearing to resist. So where do we want to take technology and development and knowledge sharing from here on? What can we proactively do, and what are we, what are people doing? So yeah, so maybe
Great,
practical discussion.
So I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. Right, now we've got about 50 minutes left, and I wondered whether we could have very brief reports back from those rooms of anything to sort of share with the other groups. I wasn't quite organized enough to allocate somebody in our room, but I'm wondering, because she's left her camera on, Rowan, whether you'd be willing to report back from group one, very brief, or what you took from it, just one thing you took from it. How about that you want to share with others?
Yes, I'll give it a go. I don't think I took very good notes, but so we discussed the differences between, or the differences of digital capitalism, the kind of extraction and selling of data, how it differs to other commodities, the way that data is valuable when it's processed, and you also need a lot of it. And then we discussed data colonialism, and that ultimately the function remains the same, which is to dispossess. And so far, there's not been very much, I think, resistance or organized resistance to it. We did talk a bit more, but I didn't take more notes, but it was very interesting.
Great, thanks very much, Sharon. I mean, we can come back to this in the time that we've got, but Ruth, do you want to either report back or nominate somebody willing?
Yeah, I mean, we had a very well-balanced discussion, I think, and I don't think anyone was like completely pro or anti, but our discussion was mainly, or not mainly, but there was quite a lot around, again, data harvesting, and one of our participants was talking about his data from his farm being harvested without his consent, really, and then being used by corporate interests to potentially then try and sell things back, but also collecting of data, I think it was around soils, using a model that wasn't necessarily that helpful in the specifics of that farm because it was so very generalized, which maybe takes us back to this whole thing of it needing to be more sort of human to farm interaction, and the potential for sharing knowledge that we all have, and perhaps again this resistance that that corporates have to us sharing knowledge because there isn't a way of extracting from that. But yeah, it wasn't that we were, completely against these things, but just a great deal of suspicion, maybe is too strong a word, but nervousness around who uses this data, who acquires it, and then what are they trying to sell back to us, which perhaps isn't necessarily as helpful us as it might be to the people trying to sell it to us. And just that, so it was a good balanced discussion, but it's maybe needing to respect our own knowledge a bit more and collaborate. If we are going to develop technologies, collaborate between ourselves to develop them rather than it always being top down. So grassroots activities such as farm hacks and what have you, and 3D printing. And I think I did see some 3D printing at the Scottish farm hack. So yeah, you can't accuse us all of being Luddites. We love a bit of technology when it's appropriate.
So did the Luddites, so that's another issue.
Well, exactly. I know it's a throwaway phrase, and it's meaningless. I shouldn't have even said the L word.
Lovely, Ruth. Thank you. And maybe we'll go to Saurabh, and I suspect Pat might have the longest feedback. So Saurabh and then Pat.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Perhaps somebody else from the tiny group we had only 4 or 5 people. Perhaps somebody else from there wants to report rather than me doing it. Any volunteers? Okay, well, anyway, since there doesn't seem to be anybody, I won't eat up much time here. I'll just say we had a very brief sort of very small group, so we didn't discuss a lot of different things. We had a discussion largely focused on the question of coloniality and how coloniality gets embedded, built inside modern technologies, and how we might think about this design, colonial design of modern technologies. We discussed issues such as objectification of nature that these technologies embed, based upon which they further imaginations and ambitions to control. We talked about sort of extraction of resources that these technologies facilitate, often in unbridled fashion and without thinking about the adverse consequences associated with them. We also talked about agency of sort of farmers in the global south, developing countries, and how they sort of adapt and adopt and adapt and appropriate often times these modern technologies for their own sometimes short-lived benefit and very unequally distributed benefit, often with, again, quite a strong set of adverse environmental and social consequences that are unfortunately pushed under the carpet until they emerge in the form of a large protest, yeah, or suicides. Yeah, that's it. That's from our side. I think that hopefully covers what we talked about in general.
That's great, Saurabh. Thanks very much. So finally, Pat, and then I think we'll be getting into sort of if you could restate your question in the chat if it hasn't been covered in the breakout group, then we'll do our best to come to it before we have a final round. Pat, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. We had a discussion of two halves, really, and it was probably unrealistic to think that we were going to start defining criteria for the assessment of appropriate technology in 30 minutes. But what did come through very clearly is that how you define appropriate technology, how you assess it, depends on which agroecology you're talking about. And I think this is not discussed often enough, and it should be discussed more. You know, are we talking about the science? Are we talking about the mix and match menu of agronomic techniques, or are we talking about the social movement? Because each of those agroecologies may have a different emphasis on how it assesses technology. And this is, if I can be controversial enough to say, it's a weakness in the agroecological approach, is that agroecology can be so many different things to so many different people. But in the main, we looked at themes of responsible development and use, and the discussion of what kind of values, you know, those should be based on, whether it's based on ecology or fairness or humility, or health, or an understanding of the systemic nature of farming. We talked about evidence of benefit, and whether we need to look at the problem not from, we have a technology, how can we use it, but what is the problem we're actually trying to solve, and what resources exist to solve that problem. I think there was a recognition I heard in what people were saying about the need to acknowledge that the problems that we face in farming aren't just farming problems. They can often be social problems, and they're complex, and they can't necessarily be reduced to technological solutions. I think there was also a need to acknowledge that the market plays a role in how we assess technology. What happens? How do we ensure that there's no for instance, in the case of GMOs, there's no contamination. What are the processes in place? And so there was a lot of talk around that, but there was also an acknowledgement. We got into a discussion about this many agroecologies, and how the use of words like agroecology have come to supplant things like organic. And, you know, for instance, a lot of people don't know that the IDDRI report that talks about agroecology by 2030 is based almost entirely on organic research, but nobody ever talks about organic anymore. So what's happened there? Has the organic community lost a thread? Has it been co-opted by others, by either industrial agroecology or other types of agroecologies? Are we all working together well or not? So we opened a bit of a can of worms there, and then the room shut. So that's as far as we got.
Thanks, Pat. So we're going to do a quick round at the end, but I'd see a question from David Newman that's come up and has actually had an answer already in the chat, but I wanted, Ruth, the question is, how can farmers develop technology rather than simply accept what is sold? Ian has mentioned Ag Open GPS, where farmers can create their own GPS guidance systems. Would you like to mention any others, either in the UK or abroad?
Yes, well, pre-COVID, we at the Land Workers Alliance were active in organising farm hacks where farmers would get together around a particular theme. It might be soil or machinery, or it might be regional. I ran one specifically for women on my farm here. So it's the sort of thing that any farmer, you know, who either wants to open the floor to other people to develop ideas, you know, workshop ideas, literally or metaphorically, workshop ideas. So, and now with, you know, the online community, so many farmers are online talking about what they're doing and what they'd like to do, that, you know, the possibilities for physical meetups along with collaboration online are really enormous. You know, what can be done, and that's, you know, that's so much potential there. We don't have to, you know, wait for a big corporation to develop something, because we know what we want. I mean, even here, and I'm not the greatest you know, welder or tech adapter. I've done things to pieces of machinery on my farm to make it more appropriate, just like, you know, any kind of appropriate technology, appropriately scaled. As an example, sorry, I'm going on, but as an example, because I run a medium scale, should we say, vegetable growing operation, but it's over a broad scale of 50 plus different types of vegetables. So the kind of technology that I need for that specific operation isn't really available in the UK. It's either small scale garden stuff or very large scale farm stuff. So bringing the two together and adapting what is available to something appropriate. So I think what I'm saying is, if I can do it on my farm with a bit of help, then I'm sure any other farmer could do that, set something up, and it's sociable too, which is feeding into the you know, the problems around isolation and you know, maintaining our mental health, being more sociable, feeling like we're working together rather than working against each other, which is what, certainly in the UK farming, it's been rather insular and not so cooperative, and we can certainly use technology to overcome that.
Thanks, Ruth. Great. I was just going to say in my sort of summary remarks, and then I was we'll pass on to a colleague from one of the networks in which ETC is involved, that I think the challenge which I sort of began my introduction with is that technology, as we experience it at the moment, both farmers, fisherfolk, consumers, is controlled by a very small number of corporations. And so I think the short-term challenge which ETC's been involved in trying to address is the fact that right from the late 90s, when Monsanto patented its Terminator technology, which would have stopped farmers saving seeds at all on a certain number of crops that could have then increased, you know, that's been a challenge to actually assess the potential and say no to technologies that are likely to be harmful. So what ETC is involved with, first in Latin America, but now in most parts of the world, including Europe, with our colleagues in Polynice, who I see Joanne's in this call from France and Confédération Paysanne, is actually helping people assess technologies like GM, like digitalization. And Yodit Kabede, who is in the call, is involved in the African Technology Assessment Platform. So I just wanted to give her a minute to just say a tiny bit about what she's doing there. Over to you, Yodit.
So the AfriTab is a platform of different civil society organizations and local communities, which are aiming at evaluating these new technologies entering in Africa. We have seen actually in recent years that African continent has been a destination and also a testing place for a number of new technologies. And these technologies are bringing rapid change on the continent, and they are across a number of sectors, and not only in agriculture, but also in health and in finance is also an important area. And my role now in AfriTab will be actually to expand this existing network, and also to strengthen this existing network in order to assess with the more priority technologies on which we can work in order to increase awareness on those technologies, and also assess their impact on the communities, and also inform then policy makers about those technologies and their impact.
Fantastic, that's perfect, Yoda. I'm afraid there is a session straight after us. So we've got 30 seconds in which to thank Pat and Ruth and everybody who took part in the breakout groups, Saurabh, Yodit, and as you know from the blurb about ORFC, this discussion can continue in other spaces, but thanks very much and enjoy the rest of the conference, and hope to see you in person as well as virtually. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, everyone. Bye.